My name is Emily, and I need to tell you this story before I lose my nerve entirely. I'm 34, sitting in my empty Clapham flat, staring at divorce papers that still smell like James's cologne, that warm, woody scent that used to make me feel safe. Now it just makes me sick with regret. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though I'm not sure there's any version of this that makes me look like anything other than the villain I've become. I've always been good at lying, you see. Not the small white lies everyone tells. I mean the elaborate architectural lies that become the foundation of an entire false life. Growing up in Croydon wasn't exactly the fairy tale I dreamed of. My parents, bless them, were perfectly content with their modest terraced house and their quiet, honest lives. Dad worked in accounts for a small firm. Mum was a teaching assistant. They loved each other deeply, contentedly, in a way that made me feel suffocated rather than secure. When Dad's friend offered him a partnership in a dodgy scheme, nothing illegal, just creative accounting, Dad refused without hesitation. "I won't take money that isn't earned, Em," he'd say, and Mum would nod approvingly while I seethed with frustration at their moral rigidity. I wanted more. I wanted the life I saw in magazines, the designer clothes, the expensive restaurants, the flat in Chelsea, rather than this cramped house where the heating barely worked. I was clever enough to earn a scholarship to an exclusive grammar school in Westminster, and that's where I learned to reinvent myself entirely. For a year, I was the quiet scholarship girl, studying my classmates like specimens. I learned how they walked, that particular confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. I learned how they spoke, dropping casual references to ski holidays and family estates. Most importantly, I learned how to lie with such conviction that even I began to believe my fabrications. By my second year, I was Emily from the expensive side of Clapham, daughter of successful business owners who were terribly busy and rarely available for school events. My lies were seamless, my accent refined, my confidence unshakable. I became popular, envied even, for my supposed wealth and sophistication. The irony wasn't lost on me that my greatest achievement was built entirely on deception. James entered my life when I was 17, though I didn't pay him much attention then. He was our neighbor's friend, 8 years older and already established in his career as a structural engineer. He'd noticed me, though, noticed me in a way that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. James was kind, steady, and hopelessly smitten with the girl I pretended to be. When I finished school without securing a scholarship to Cambridge, my parents suggested a local university and a practical degree. The thought filled me with horror. James, overhearing one of our heated arguments through the thin walls, offered to sponsor my education. My parents, surprised but grateful, agreed immediately. They saw James as the big brother I'd never had. University was everything I'd dreamed of. With James's generous support, I lived in the best accommodation, wore the right clothes, and seamlessly continued my masquerade among new friends who assumed my wealth was real. I felt guilty sometimes when James would call to check on me, his voice warm with genuine affection. But guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford when I was so close to the life I'd always wanted. James and I began our romantic relationship in my third year, after I'd grown tired of dating wealthy but shallow boys who treated me like an accessory. With James, I felt something different, something real that terrified me as much as it comforted me. He loved me completely, without reservation, in a way I'd never experienced. Looking back now, I realize I took that love for granted from the very beginning. When we were apart, I barely responded to his calls or messages. When we were together, I was fully present but emotionally guarded, as if his devotion was simply my due rather than a precious gift. After graduation, James proposed. I accepted, but with conditions. We had to move away from London, start fresh somewhere new. I couldn't bear the thought of my university friends discovering my humble origins, or my parents' modest lifestyle undermining the image I'd so carefully crafted. James agreed without question, as he always did. We settled in Brighton, in a lovely Victorian terrace that drained most of James's savings. He'd left his well-paying London job for something more modest, and between the mortgage, furnishing our new home, and the various loans he'd taken to make it all possible, money was tight. Tighter than I'd ever experienced. I found myself trapped in domestic drudgery while James worked long hours to keep us afloat. The house felt like a prison after the freedom of university life. I cleaned, cooked, and waited for James to come home so I could have some human interaction. When he asked about my day, I had nothing to say except complaints about our financial situation. The irony was crushing. I'd married a good man who adored me, and all I could think about was how his love wasn't enough to give me the lifestyle I craved. For a year, I searched unsuccessfully for employment. Every rejection felt like a personal insult, proof that my dreams were slipping further away. I took my frustrations out on James, who absorbed my anger with maddening patience. When he apologized for things that weren't his fault, I felt even more frustrated rather than grateful. His gentleness felt like weakness, his devotion like desperation. Finally, James mentioned casually that his company needed a new secretary. His boss, Richard Blackwood, had fired the previous one for incompetence. James warned me about Richard, described him as brilliant but ruthless, charismatic but volatile. "I don't want to see you getting hurt, Em," he said. "Richard can be intense." I should have listened. Instead, I applied behind James's back. The interview was unlike anything I'd experienced. Richard Blackwood was exactly as James had described. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to pull all the oxygen from the room. His office was a testament to wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Brighton's seafront, abstract art that probably cost more than James's annual salary, furniture that screamed expensive taste. Richard studied me with unsettling intensity, his steel gray eyes taking in every detail of my appearance. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a fitted black dress that showed my figure without being inappropriate, heels that made my legs look endless, my auburn hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon. I caught him looking and felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in months, the thrill of being desired by a powerful man. "You're James Fletcher's wife," he said, not asking but stating. "Yes, but I hope you'll judge me on my own merits," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. He smiled then, a slow, predatory expression that should have alarmed me, but instead sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "Oh, I always do, Mrs. Fletcher. I always do." I got the job. James wasn't pleased, but he buried his concerns as usual. I made him promise not to reveal our marriage to anyone at the office, especially not to Richard. It seemed easier that way, more professional. James agreed reluctantly, and I felt a small thrill at having a secret, even one as innocent as this. For the first few months, Richard was traveling, setting up the company's New York branch. The office ran smoothly in his absence, and I proved myself capable and efficient. When he returned, I was ready to impress him. Richard Blackwood in person was even more magnetic than I'd remembered. He had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room when his attention was focused on you. His praise felt like validation, his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, fingers brushing mine as he passed documents, sent electricity through my skin. I began staying late, working on special projects that Richard claimed required my particular skills. James would complain about my long hours, but the substantial bonuses I received silenced his objections. I didn't tell him about the bonuses, of course. I wanted that money for myself, for the things James couldn't provide. Slowly, I began to change. I bought new clothes with my extra income, more expensive pieces that Richard noticed and complimented. I started wearing my hair down more often, noticed how Richard's eyes followed the movement when I walked. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply being professional and confident. But late at night, when James was sleeping peacefully beside me, I would lie awake thinking about Richard's smile, the way his voice dropped when he spoke to me privately, the heat in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. When Richard announced he needed to travel to New York again for an extended period and wanted me to accompany him, I felt my pulse quicken. James was horrified at the prospect of my being away for an unknown length of time. We argued bitterly the night before I was scheduled to leave. "Just tell him you're married," James pleaded. "Tell him your husband objects." "I can't risk my career for this, James," I snapped. "You, of all people, should understand what this opportunity means." I slept in the guest room that night and left before he woke up, ignoring his increasingly desperate texts once I was airborne. New York was everything I'd dreamed it would be: towering glass and steel, energy that crackled in the very air, sophistication oozing from every corner. Richard had booked us into the plaza in suites that probably cost more per night than James earned in a month. My room was elegant beyond anything I'd ever experienced, all marble and silk and stunning views of Central Park. "I hope you're comfortable," Richard said when he came to check on me that first evening. He stood in my doorway, looking effortlessly polished in his tailored suit, and I felt suddenly aware of my silk robe, the way it clung to my curves, how my hair fell in loose waves around my shoulders. "It's incredible," I breathed, and something in his expression shifted. "You deserve incredible things, Emily," he said quietly, and the way he said my name made my stomach flutter. Our work days were intense but invigorating. Richard treated me as an equal, sought my opinions, praised my insights. In the evenings, he took me to restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, places where a single meal cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I felt like Cinderella, finally living the fairy tale I'd always imagined. I found myself dressing more carefully each morning, choosing pieces that flattered my figure, colors that brought out the green in my eyes. Richard noticed everything, complimented the way a particular dress hugged my waist, how my hair caught the light, the elegance of my movements. His attention was intoxicating, and I found myself craving more of it. On our third night, he took me to a rooftop bar with views across Manhattan's glittering skyline. We drank champagne, real champagne, the kind that costs more than James's weekly salary, and talked about everything except work. Richard was charming, funny, surprisingly vulnerable as he spoke about his childhood, his fears, his dreams. I found myself leaning closer, laughing at his stories, feeling more alive than I had in years. "You're wasted in Brighton," he said suddenly, his gray eyes intense in the dim lighting. "A woman like you should be in London, New York, somewhere that matches your ambition." "A woman like me?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. Beautiful, intelligent, hungry for more than suburban domesticity. His fingers traced the rim of his glass, but his eyes never left mine. "You're meant for bigger things, Emily." The word beautiful hung in the air between us like a promise. James told me I was beautiful, of course, but it felt different coming from him. Comfortable, expected. When Richard said it, it felt dangerous, thrilling, like a secret we were sharing. When we returned to the hotel that night, Richard walked me to my door. We stood close in the hallway, and I could smell his cologne. Expensive, masculine, intoxicating. He reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face, his fingers warm against my skin. "Emily," he said softly, and I knew we were standing at a crossroads. I should have said goodnight, should have gone into my room and called James, reminded myself of my marriage vows, my commitment to the man who loved me unconditionally. Instead, I tilted my face up toward his, and Richard Blackwood kissed me. His lips were firm, commanding, nothing like James's gentle kisses. This kiss was hunger and power and forbidden desire, and I felt my knees go weak with the force of it. When we broke apart, I was breathless. "I should go," I whispered, but I made no move toward my door. "Should you?" His thumb traced my lower lip, and I felt fire shoot straight through me. "What do you want, Emily?" "Really want?" What I wanted was to feel desired, powerful, worthy of a man like Richard Blackwood. What I wanted was the life he represented: luxury, sophistication, freedom from the mundane concerns of mortgage payments and household budgets. What I wanted was to forget, just for one night, that I was married to a kind, steady man who deserved so much better than me. I began, then stopped, aware that my next words would change everything. Richard waited, patient as a hunter. "I want to feel alive again," I finished and opened my door. He followed me inside. That night was a revelation. Not just the physical intimacy, though Richard was skilled and confident in ways that made me feel like I was discovering my own body for the first time, but the entire experience of being with someone who saw me as an equal. a prize worth winning rather than a burden to be endured. Afterward, lying in the tangle of expensive hotel sheets, I felt alive in a way I hadn't since my university days. Richard traced patterns on my bare shoulder, murmuring words of praise and desire that made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. When morning came, along with guilt and reality, Richard was ready with flowers and jewelry, tokens of his appreciation that cost more than James earned in months. The gifts should have made me feel cheap, bought, but instead they made me feel valued in a way I'd forgotten was possible. We stayed in New York for 3 more weeks, and they were the most intoxicating of my life. Days filled with meaningful work and Richard's attention, evenings at the finest restaurants and cultural events, nights lost in passion and the heady rush of being desired by a powerful man. I barely thought about James, and when I did, it was with a mixture of guilt and resentment. How could he compete with this? How could our small life in Brighton compare to the sophistication and luxury Richard offered? When it was time to return to London, I felt like I was being exiled from paradise. Coming home to Brighton felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Everything seemed smaller, shabbier, more confining than before. James met me at the door with flowers and relief, eager to hear about my trip, desperate to reconnect after our weeks apart. I lied, of course. Told him about business meetings and professional development, about missing him and being glad to be home. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but James believed them because he wanted to, because he trusted me completely. The photograph appeared in a business journal 2 days later, Richard and me at a charity gala, caught in what looked like an intimate moment but was actually just conversation. Still, the optics were undeniable. We looked like a couple, sophisticated and well-matched, him in his perfectly tailored tuxedo and me in the emerald dress he'd bought me, diamonds glittering at my throat. James saw it before I did, left the journal open on our kitchen table like evidence in a trial. When I came downstairs for breakfast, he was sitting there with his coffee gone cold, staring at the photograph with an expression I'd never seen before, hurt and confusion and something that might have been dawning understanding. "It's not what it looks like," I said automatically, the lie coming as easily as breathing. "The photographer caught us at an odd angle." We were just talking business. James wanted to believe me. I could see the relief in his eyes when he accepted my explanation. He was so trusting, so willing to think the best of me, that I felt simultaneously grateful and contemptuous. Over the following weeks, packages began arriving at our house. Designer clothes, jewelry, handbags worth more than James's monthly salary. I claimed they were gifts from a wealthy friend I'd made in New York, someone who appreciated my professional support and wanted to show her gratitude. James looked skeptical but said nothing, just retreated into himself in a way that should have alarmed me but instead irritated me. The affair continued back in Brighton, conducted in Richard's office after hours, and in expensive hotel rooms when he traveled to London for meetings. I told James I was working late, attending professional development courses, meeting with clients. He stopped asking questions, stopped trying to connect with me, and I told myself his withdrawal proved we were growing apart naturally. I was living 2 lives, dutiful wife to James by night, sophisticated mistress to Richard during the day, and the effort was exhausting. But I couldn't give up either role. I needed James's stability and devotion, but I craved Richard's passion and the lifestyle he represented. The end came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late spring. I was at home doing laundry and feeling sorry for myself about our mundane domestic life when I heard a knock at the door. I assumed it was a delivery or perhaps a neighbor, certainly not Richard Blackwood standing on my doorstep in his expensive suit, surveying our modest terrace house like it was a particularly disappointing museum exhibit. "Richard," I gasped, glancing nervously up and down the street. "What are you doing here?" He pushed past me into our small hallway, his presence immediately making everything feel cramped and shabby. His eyes took in our wedding photos on the mantelpiece, the worn furniture James and I had bought secondhand, the careful budget-conscious choices that defined our life together. "Charming," he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Very authentic." "I can explain," I began, but he cut me off with a laugh. "Explain what, Emily?" That you've been lying to me about your circumstances? That you're married to one of my employees?" He picked up our wedding photo, studied it with amusement. "Oh, I've known from the beginning, darling. I don't sleep with my employees' wives without doing my research first." The casual cruelty in his voice made me feel sick. "Then why?" "Because you made it so easy," he said simply. "Beautiful, ambitious, clearly unsatisfied with your boring little life. You practically threw yourself at me, Emily. How could I resist?" I felt the world tilt around me as I realized the truth. I hadn't been special to Richard, hadn't been the sophisticated equal I'd imagined. I'd been entertainment, a diversion, a married woman desperate enough for luxury that she'd betray her husband for designer handbags and expensive dinners. Richard moved around our sitting room like a predator marking territory, picking up objects and setting them down with disdain. When he reached the laundry basket, he pulled out one of the dresses he'd bought me in New York, held it up to the light like evidence. "Does James know where these lovely things came from?" he asked conversationally. "Does he know his wife has been fucking her boss for months?" "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was begging for. That's when I heard James's key in the lock. He appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes, lunch bag in one hand, and stopped dead when he saw Richard in our sitting room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Richard smiled, that predatory smile I'd once found so attractive. "James," he said pleasantly, "how lovely to finally meet you properly. I was just telling your wife how much I've enjoyed our professional relationship." James looked between us, and I saw the exact moment understanding dawned in his eyes. The color drained from his face, but he stood straighter, taller, finding dignity I didn't know he possessed. "Get out of my house," he said quietly. "Oh, I don't think you're in a position to make demands," Richard replied, clearly enjoying himself. "You see, James, your wife has been rather grateful for my mentorship. Haven't you, Emily?" He grabbed the dress from the laundry basket and threw it at James, this beautiful, expensive thing landing at my husband's feet like an accusation. "Perhaps you should ask her where she got the money for clothes like this. Or maybe you already know and just don't care that your wife is a—" That's when I laughed. I don't know why. Hysteria, perhaps? Or the awful recognition that my carefully constructed life was collapsing around me and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The sound came out sharp and bitter, and both men turned to stare at me in shock. James's face went white, then red, then white again. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before, like I was a stranger who'd somehow invaded his wife's body. The hurt in his eyes was so raw, so devastating, that I felt something break inside my chest. "James, please, let me explain." But he was already turning away, already walking toward the door with mechanical precision. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard drawers opening and closing in our bedroom, heard the front door slam so hard the windows rattled. Richard chuckled, straightening his tie. "Well, that was entertaining. You might want to look for a new position, by the way. I've decided I no longer require your services." He left me standing in the wreckage of my marriage, surrounded by the expensive gifts that had cost me everything I'd ever truly had. James returned a week later, not to reconcile, but to deliver divorce papers with the cold efficiency of the engineer he was. He'd calculated the end of our marriage like a structural problem, identifying the load-bearing walls that had failed and condemning the entire edifice as unsound. He looked different, thinner, older, but somehow more solid, as if losing his illusions about me had freed him from some burden he'd carried for years. When I tried to touch him, to bridge the distance between us with physical contact, he stepped back like I might contaminate him. "James, please, we can work through this." "No," he said simply. "We can't." The certainty in his voice was more devastating than anger would have been. He'd moved past hurt into something colder and more final, acceptance. I was no longer a person he loved who had betrayed him. I was a mistake he was correcting, a problem he was solving. I begged, pleaded, promised to change, to be better, to love him the way he deserved. But my words bounced off him like rain off stone. He'd heard my promises before, had believed in them, and been disappointed too many times. I'd used up all my chances without realizing they were limited. "I loved you, Emily," he said as he prepared to leave. "I loved you more than I've ever loved anyone or anything, but I can't love someone who doesn't exist." After he left, I sat in our empty house, my empty house now, surrounded by the designer clothes and expensive jewelry that had seemed so important just weeks before. They looked different now, tawdry and meaningless, evidence of my corruption rather than symbols of the sophisticated life I'd craved. I tried to return to work, but Richard had been true to his word. Security escorted me from the building with my personal belongings in a cardboard box, and whispers followed me down the hallway. Everyone knew. The scandal of the boss's affair with his employee's wife was too delicious to remain secret. My parents, when they learned the truth, were devastated. Not just by my betrayal of James, but by the years of lies I'd told, the false person I'd pretended to be. They'd loved Emily the scholarship girl, the bright daughter who'd married the kind boy next door. They couldn't recognize the woman who'd thrown away everything good in her life for designer dresses and expensive dinners. "How could you do this to James?" my mother asked through tears. "He loved you like you hung the moon, Emily. He gave you everything he had, and you destroyed him for what? For things? For money?" I had no answer because there was no answer that made sense. I'd traded love for luxury, substance for surface, reality for the fantasy I'd been chasing since I was 17 years old. And in getting everything I thought I wanted, I'd lost everything that actually mattered. The house went up for sale. I couldn't afford the mortgage on my own, couldn't bear to live surrounded by memories of the life I'd destroyed. I moved back to London to a tiny flat in zones that had no prestige, working temporary jobs that barely covered my rent. The sophisticated life I'd imagined receded further every day, revealed as the mirage it had always been. James moved on. I heard through mutual friends that he'd taken a position with a firm in Manchester, started fresh somewhere I couldn't accidentally encounter him. Someone mentioned he was dating, a colleague, someone age-appropriate and kind, someone who deserved his steadfast heart in ways I never had. I should have been happy for him. Instead, I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything essential and left only the shell of who I used to be. Late at night, alone in my small flat with its cheap furniture and thin walls, I would lie awake thinking about the life I'd had and thrown away. James reading the newspaper over breakfast, his quiet chuckle at particularly absurd headlines, the way he'd pull me close when I was cold, wrapping his arms around me like I was something precious that needed protecting. His patient explanations of engineering principles when I'd ask about his work, his genuine interest in my thoughts and opinions. I'd had a man who loved me unconditionally, who'd sacrificed his own comfort for my happiness, who'd seen the best in me even when I couldn't see it in myself. And I'd betrayed him for a man who saw me as entertainment, a convenient outlet for his appetites, a woman so desperate for luxury that she'd sell her integrity for the price of a handbag. The worst part wasn't the loneliness or the financial struggle, or even the knowledge that I'd become the villain in my own story. The worst part was understanding, finally and too late, what I'd actually lost. Not just James, but the version of myself that had been worthy of his love. That Emily, flawed but trying, ambitious but not heartless, might have built something real and lasting if she hadn't been so busy chasing fairy tales. I'd spent my entire adult life lying about who I was, creating elaborate fictions to impress people who didn't really know me. The only person who'd ever loved me for who I actually was, I'd driven away with my deception and cruelty and insatiable hunger for more. Now I sit in my empty flat, 34 years old and utterly alone, writing this story as a kind of penance. There's no redemption at the end of this tale. No moment of grace where love conquers all and broken things are made whole. I broke something irreplaceable, and all the regret in the world can't put it back together. James was right. He couldn't love someone who doesn't exist, and the person I actually am, beneath all the lies and pretense and desperate grasping, is someone I'm not sure anyone could love. Perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that I lost James, but that I lost myself so completely along the way that I don't even know how to begin finding my way back to the truth. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's simple. Be careful what you sacrifice for your dreams, because sometimes the cost is everything that actually matters, and by the time you realize what you've given up, it's far too late to get it back. The woman who began this story believed she deserved more than what she had. The woman ending it knows that what she had was more than she deserved, and that knowledge, arrived at too late to matter, is the heaviest burden of all. Life sometimes reveals the greatest betrayals in the most unexpected places. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new tales of office intrigue, love, betrayal, and revenge. Every day, a new Office Saga awaits you.